Chapter 1. Binta Equensi knelt among the rose thorns where bindweed had claimed the lower stems. The late afternoon light filtered through the overgrown canopy in thin, uneven shafts, catching on the dust that clung to her sleeves and the fine hairs on her forearms. Her knees pressed into the yielding earth, still damp from the morning rain, and each shift sent a small release of crushed green into the air. Her fingertip followed the central vein of a surviving leaf until it snagged on a stiff corner of paper wedged against the wood. She worked the fragment loose without tearing it further, the paper rasping faintly against the thorn, and held it to the failing light, her breath slowing as the first brown letters resolved themselves. The garden pressed close around her, heavy with the scent of damp earth and the sharper tang of crushed stems beneath her knees. She had come out here intending only to clear a patch for the spring, yet the fragment refused to be ignored. Questions formed before she could dismiss them. How long had this scrap lain here, and why had no previous tenant noticed it among the thorns? The ink had browned, but the words remained clear enough. They spoke of an inheritance kept from the children, a cottage transferred under a different name 3 decades earlier than any family account had admitted. Binta stood, the paper balanced between thumb and forefinger, and carried it toward the kitchen door, her steps measured against the uneven flagstones. The cottage door creaked as she entered, and the air inside smelled of cold stone and the oil she had rubbed into the table the week before. She placed the fragment on the sill where the last daylight still reached, and read the lines again. The handwriting belonged to someone who had signed only with an initial, yet the detail about the garden layout matched what her father had once described in passing. Her thumb traced the edge of the paper as dusk thickened the windowpane, turning the glass into a mirror that reflected her own uncertain expression back at her. Outside, the wind moved the branches in slow arcs, casting shifting patterns across the floorboards that seemed to mirror the uncertainty tightening in her chest. A second sheet slid from the binding of the ledger she had opened earlier. It landed face upward on the floor with a soft, deliberate sound that seemed louder than it should have. The name written there was her great-grandfather's, listed as the original owner in a year before her own father had been born. Binta read the name aloud, then stopped, the measured cadence she used with her students now uneven. Obinanwasu, she whispered, and the syllables lingered in the cooling room. Her mind turned to her father's long silences on the subject of the cottage, the way his shoulders had tightened whenever the old place was mentioned. She remained still for several minutes, listening to the settling of the house around her, the faint creak of beans adjusting to the dropping temperature, while her thoughts circled the possibility that entire branches of family knowledge had been deliberately pruned. She returned to the garden after the light had gone. In the dark, she pressed a single bulb into the soil, where the letter fragment had rested. The earth gave under her hands more readily than she expected, releasing a faint scent of turned leaves and something sharper she could not place. Her fingers worked methodically, patting the soil flat, yet each motion stirred fragments of memory she had set aside. That scent carried her back to visits she had not considered in years, afternoons when her father had left her at the gate and walked on alone. She could almost hear the gravel shifting under his shoes, the low murmur of voices from inside the cottage that had never included her. She finished covering the bulb and brushed the dirt from her palms against her skirt, the fabric catching on the fine grit. The darkness made every rustle of foliage feel closer, as though the garden itself were testing how much she would notice before retreating. At the threshold she paused. The telephone sat on the side table, but she did not lift the receiver. Her hand hovered near it for a moment before dropping away. Instead, she closed the door and returned to the kitchen window where both pages now lay. The decision settled in her chest like a held breath. Whatever these documents revealed, she would not yet share it with the only relative left to her. The cottage felt smaller in that instant, its walls holding the weight of things unspoken. She imagined the conversation that might follow, a cousin's polite surprise, then the quick pivot to safer topics, and the image kept her hands still. The date on the second sheet fell 3 years after the break her father had always described as final. Binta traced the numerals with the same finger that had followed the leaf vein. The numbers suggested a correspondence continued in secret, yet no further letters appeared in the ledger. She leaned closer to the window, the glass cool against her forearm, and wondered what other papers might lie hidden in the bindings she had not yet examined. The thought brought no comfort, only a tightening in her throat as the implications widened. If the break had never been complete, then the silences she remembered were not absences but choices. A soft knock sounded at the garden gate. Binta set the pages down and crossed the room. When she opened the gate, nothing moved on the path or among the bushes. She stood for a moment listening to the night insects, then secured the latch again. The sound had been distinct, neither wind nor branch, yet the darkness offered no explanation. She lingered at the gate longer than necessary, her pulse steady but alert, before turning back. The unanswered summons seemed to hang in the air, an invitation extended and then withdrawn. She carried the named page back inside and read the signature once more. The handwriting matched the fragment exactly. Binta placed both sheets inside the ledger and closed it, yet the date continued to occupy the space between her thoughts and the quiet room. She had not expected the garden to answer her directly. The bulbs she had planted would remain invisible until spring, and the letters offered only a beginning. Binta turned the lamp lower and sat at the table, her hands resting on the closed ledger, while the unanswered knock repeated itself in memory. Who kept this from us all this time? Chapter 2. Farida al-Mansur pressed the first seed into the straight row she had marked at dawn. The soil gave under her fingertips with a cool resistance that reminded her of other mornings long before this one, when dew still clung to the edges of the cottage roof and the air carried the faint trace of wood smoke from an earlier fire. She worked steadily, her knees pressing small depressions into the turned earth, and spoke the garden rules aloud as she moved down the line. Her voice carried the cadence of stories told to children who had grown and left, the words emerging with the measured warmth of habit rather than any expectation of reply. Keep the rows even so, each plant receives its share of light. Water at the base, never the leaves. Watch for the first signs of trouble before they spread. The words filled the empty air and returned to her unchanged, settling against the low stone wall that bounded the garden. Time had already thinned the voices that once answered her. She remembered how her own father had stood at this same edge of ground when the cottage still held 3 generations under one roof, his hands rough from the same trowel she now held, his laughter rising when a row came out crooked. Those years had slipped into others, carrying away the habit of speaking together at dusk, until the rooms inside held only the weight of what remained unsaid. Farida pressed another seed, her fingers brushing aside a small stone that caught the light like a fragment of bone. The morning chill had not yet lifted from the ground, and the dampness worked its way through the fabric of her sleeves where they brushed the soil. She paused after the third seed. She tilted her head toward the cottage window as she always did when the rows demanded stillness, her breath forming a brief cloud that dissolved against the pale sky. The glass reflected the roofline and the slow drift of clouds above it, offering no glimpse of movement within. Into that reflection she placed the absence her father had carried without naming it, the silence that had settled after a single unanswered question years earlier. The one about the land titles and the branch of the family no one would discuss. The neat lines of turned earth seemed to hold the same withheld answer, each furrow a reminder of decisions made in rooms she had not entered. A footstep broke the rhythm, the sound of boots on the gravel path that skirted the garden's edge. The patriarch entered from the side path, his boots leaving prints that crossed her work in uneven strides. He stopped at the end of the first row and looked down at the seeds already placed, his coat buttoned high against the morning air, his face set in the same closed expression he wore when letters arrived unopened. Farida felt the shift in the air before he spoke, the way the quiet tightened around his presence. His voice came clipped and direct. No mention of the letter. Not today. Not while the ground is open. Farida kept her hands on the trowel, the wooden handle cool and worn smooth from years of use. The order cut through the morning air without room for reply, leaving no space for the questions that had already begun to form in her mind about who had sent the earlier correspondence and why it must remain buried. She nodded once, the motion small and contained, and returned to the row, pressing each remaining seed with the same even pressure. The patriarch waited until she reached the final mark, his stance unmoving, then turned back toward the house without further word. She finished the row in the quiet he had required, the soil settling under her palms without further sound, though her thoughts lingered on the folded paper that had arrived days before and the name it had contained. Later she stood at the outdoor tap and let the water run over her hands until the last grains of earth loosened and swirled into the drain. The post arrived while the water still dripped from her wrists, the carrier's boots crunching along the path in a rhythm that broke the afternoon stillness. The envelope bore no return address, only the cottage name written in a hand she did not recognize, the ink slightly smudged as though carried through rain somewhere along its route. Inside, a single sheet stated that descendants from another branch would seek the property in time. The word suggested arrival still ahead, names not yet spoken in these rooms, and hinted at bloodlines that might reconnect what had been severed. She folded the sheet once and carried it inside, the paper crisp against her palm. The loose floorboard near the hearth lifted without resistance, as it had for other papers kept from view, revealing the shallow space beneath where shadows pooled. She placed the letter beneath it and let the board settle back into place, the faint click of wood against wood marking the choice to withhold it from the patriarch, an echo of earlier decisions that had shaped the years between, each one leaving its own layer of quiet in its wake. Dusk brought cooler air across the garden, carrying the scent of turned earth and the distant rustle of leaves beyond the wall. Farida returned to check the rows before the light failed, her steps slow on the path. One seedling already showed a curl at its tip, the stem thinner than the others around it, the first signs of strain visible in the way it leaned slightly away from the even line. The enforced quiet of the morning had left its mark in the smallest place, a visible consequence of words held back. She knelt beside the wilted stem and spoke softly so the sound would stay within the garden walls, her fingers hovering near the soil without touching it. Others will come who remember how to speak the names again. The rose will hold them the way they held us. Her words carried the garden metaphors she used only when alone, images of roots that reached farther than any single season allowed, of branches that might yet knit what had been divided. The light continued to fade, casting longer shadows across the prepared ground. The patriarch's shadow crossed the window once more as the last light left the sky, his figure pausing briefly behind the glass before moving on. The confirmation of continued silence passed over the glass and settled on the ground she had prepared, a reminder that the order still held. Farida remained where she knelt until the shadow withdrew, the coolness of the evening air settling into her shoulders. She lifted the floorboard again while the last gray light remained, the board shifting with the same ease as before. The letter lay where she had placed it, the hint of new blood still legible in the fading illumination. She read the line once more before the darkness completed its cover, the words steady in her mind as the garden settled into night. Chapter 3. Jiro Nakamura pushed the broken gate aside with one shoulder. The wood gave under his palm, splinters catching on his sleeve as he stepped onto the path where grass had already claimed the stones. Mid-morning light struck the cottage facade at an angle that revealed every missing mortar line, every brick shifted by decades of frost and root pressure. The air carried the faint bitterness of decaying leaves and damp earth, undisturbed for months. He paused at the threshold, listening to the creak of the hinge settling back into its warped frame before moving forward. He moved directly to the wall and placed his hand flat against the surface. The brick held the day's warmth unevenly, some sections cool where shade from the old pear tree still lingered. His fingers followed the pattern downward until they met a gap wide enough for a thumbnail. Time had worked here without witnesses, separating what hands had once joined. The surface felt gritty under his skin, small grains of loosened mortar dusting his fingertips. He traced a single course of bricks, noting how the pattern held despite the settling foundation. A question surfaced without invitation. How many seasons had passed since anyone else had stood here and felt the same resistance in the joints? A survey stake appeared at the property line, while Jiro measured the nearest window frame with a length of string from his pocket. The orange plastic marker stood upright in soil that had not been turned since the previous season. He noted the distance to the foundation, then the distance again, as though repetition might alter the measurement. His shoulders tightened as he registered the stake's fresh placement. The string stretched taut between his hands, the coarse fibers biting into his knuckles. He shifted his weight, boots pressing into the packed earth, and measured once more, slower this time, as if the act itself could push the marker back into obscurity. The vision arrived without warning. Behind his eyes, the same brick pattern repeated in another wall, this one part of a larger structure on another continent. Names attached themselves to the image, Binta Equensi among them, her line traced through the mortar itself. The flicker passed. Jiro nodded once toward the ground at his feet, the motion small enough that only the soil could have registered it. The nod lingered in his posture, a private acknowledgement that settled into his chest. He wondered what else the pattern might reveal if he remained still long enough, yet the question brought no answer. Only the steady pressure of time slipping forward. He continued along the wall, string taut between his hands. The window frame showed the same joint work that had appeared in the vision. Each timber bore tool marks from an earlier hand, the cuts still sharp where paint had not covered them. Sunlight caught the edge of one frame, throwing a thin shadow across the bricks below. Jiro's breath moved slowly, measured like his string. He crouched to inspect a lower course, knees protesting the shift, and ran his palm along the cooler bricks where roots had pushed upward from beneath. The contact steadied something inside him even as unease coiled tighter. Jiro whispered to the stones once the string was set aside. His voice stayed low, the words precise and without flourish. The cottage had endured the movement of families and the silence between them. It would continue if the pattern held. He spoke as if addressing an old acquaintance, each syllable placed deliberately against the quiet garden. His fingers rested lightly on the wall, feeling the faint pulse of residual heat. The words left his mouth and seemed to sink into the bricks rather than disperse. For a moment he remained crouched, listening to the absence of reply, the only sound the distant rustle of leaves against the pear tree. A fragment of mortar lay at the base of the wall. He lifted it between thumb and forefinger, turning it once to see the inner face still gray and unweathered. The survey team would return within the hour, their voices already carried from the far side of the hedge. He slipped the fragment into his coat pocket. The weight settled against his side, small and insistent. He straightened slowly, scanning the tree line for movement, and took one deliberate step back from the wall. The pocket's lining brushed the fragment with each breath, a constant reminder that the evidence now traveled with him. Boundary maps waited on the porch boards when he reached the front step. Red ink marked the sale deadline 3 weeks away. The paper edges curled from damp, yet the figures remained legible. Jiro read the numbers without touching the sheet. The ink had bled slightly at the edges, creating a halo around each date. He studied the printed lines that divided the land into parcels, each boundary drawn with mechanical certainty. His jaw worked once, a subtle shift, before he stepped past the maps and into the cottage's dim interior. The attachment tightened in the space below his ribs. The vision had shown the same pattern repeated in another time. If the land changed hands, the repetition would stop. No later hand would read the jointwork the way the bricks had allowed him to read it. He stood just inside the doorway, one hand braced against the frame, and let the thought settle fully. The cottage's air felt cooler here, carrying the scent of old wood and dust. He imagined the pattern breaking under new construction, the bricks scattered or buried, and the tightness spread upward into his throat. He returned inside and lifted the loose floorboard near the hearth. The space beneath still held the impression of earlier papers. He placed the mortar fragment exactly where one such paper had rested years before. The board settled without sound. Dust rose in a thin veil and drifted back down across his sleeve. He pressed the board flat with both palms, ensuring it lay flush, then remained kneeling for several breaths. The act felt like sealing something fragile yet necessary. When he rose, his knees cracked softly in the stillness. Dusk had not yet arrived, but the light through the windows had already lengthened across the floor. Jiro remained where he stood, one hand still on the board's edge. The cottage held its own record of who had come and stayed silent. He traced the grain of the wood with one finger, following its path until it met the edge of the hearthstone. Questions multiplied behind his eyes. How much of the pattern remained hidden, and whether any future owner would recognize what the bricks still carried. An engine idled at the gate. The car did not advance. Its driver remained behind the wheel, the exhaust, a steady note against the quiet that had settled over the garden rows. Jiro did not move toward the door. The sound pressed against the cottage walls, low and persistent, while he kept his hand on the board and listened to the engine's unchanging rhythm. Outside, the survey stakes caught the light like small warnings. Chapter 4. Hadia Rahman held the ownership papers flat against the gatepost, her arms folded tight across her chest so the edges creased under her elbows. The afternoon light fell low across the rows Farida had planted, turning the turned soil the color of old tea. She read each clause twice, the pen strokes on the survey lines already fading where the ink had met rain. One boundary ran straight through what had once been a shared path between two cottages. Time had pulled that path into separate claims, yet the paper still marked it as divisible. A faint breeze carried the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke, stirring the edges of the documents without quite lifting them from her grip. A stone near her foot sat slightly higher than the others along the border. She nudged it with the toe of her shoe. The stone shifted, revealing the corner of an envelope that had been tucked beneath it for years. Hadia bent, lifted the envelope, and felt the paper's weight against her palm before she broke the brittle seal. Dust rose in a thin plume, settling on her sleeve like a quiet accusation. She paused, the envelope balanced between her fingers, listening to the distant rustle of leaves that might have been wind or something else entirely. The letter inside bore no greeting. It began mid-sentence, as if the writer had already started speaking to someone who refused to listen. The handwriting slanted sharply left, the same angle her grandfather's notes had taken when he recorded property divisions. She read the first lines aloud, her voice crisp and even. Emotional attachment to soil has no standing in any registry. The cottage passes to the highest bidder when the 3 weeks end. The words hung in the air longer than they should have, and she felt her throat tighten around the final syllable, though she kept her posture rigid. Inside, a flicker of doubt surfaced. Why had these sentences survived when so many others had not? Her arms remained crossed as she continued, though one hand now held the page steady. The letter described a sale arranged decades earlier, a signature given under pressure, and a promise that later generations would never revisit the matter. Hadia's tone sharpened on the word promise. She had built her practice on separating feeling from fact, yet the sentence lingered on the page like an unpaid debt. The paper itself felt warmer now, as if the afternoon sun had concentrated there, and she wondered whether the original writer had hesitated before pressing the seal closed. A low ache began behind her eyes, the kind that came from reading too long in poor light, yet she did not look away. The light shifted again, lengthening the shadows of the survey stakes until they pointed directly at the cottage door. Hadia unfolded the second sheet inside the envelope. A map drawn in the same ink showed the original garden divided into 3 parcels, each marked with a different initial. One initial matched the signature on her own birth record. She lowered the paper and traced the looping capital with the tip of one finger, the motion slow enough that the dust on the page lifted and settled again. Her fingertip caught on a tiny ridge in the ink, and she imagined the hand that had formed it steady or trembling, pressing down with deliberate force. The vision arrived without warning. She saw the same gate from an earlier decade. A man stood on the far side, shoulders squared against the wind. He placed a letter beneath the stone, then walked away without looking back. The woman who found it later folded it twice and hid it under the floorboard inside. Years passed in the space between one breath and the next. The woman taught her children never to mention the missing signature. Hadia recognized the woman's posture, the way she kept her hands busy with soil rather than words. The air in the vision smelled of turned earth and unspoken names. It pressed against her lungs the same way the real afternoon did now. She uncrossed her right arm to hold the letter closer to her eyes. The abandonment in the vision matched the reserve Binta carried into every room, the same silence that had kept later letters from being opened. Hadia's finger stopped at the date written at the bottom of the page. The year aligned with the one her own father had left the country. The connection sat in her chest like a stone that refused to settle. She could almost hear the scrape of his boots on gravel, the door closing without a final word, and she wondered how many times that same door had been shut since then. When the vision thinned, she crossed both arms again, the letter now pressed against her sleeve. The cost of dismissing such things had always seemed acceptable until the paper carried her own lineage in its ink. She folded the pages once more, the creases lining up with the ones already there, and slipped them into her jacket pocket. The stone she left where it had fallen, its underside still dark from having been hidden. A thin line of displaced earth marked the spot, visible now from the lane if anyone cared to look closely. Ownership records clipped to the back of the envelope showed the auction notice printed in small type at the bottom. The date fell inside the remaining 3 weeks. Hadia read the notice without moving her arms. The cottage had already been entered into the county ledger under a new heading that listed no family names, only a corporate entity formed 2 counties away. The corporate name repeated itself in her mind, each syllable flattening the history that had once lived here. From the lane came the sound of another engine, this one higher in pitch than the first. 2 men in reflective vests stepped from the vehicle and began unloading tripods near the farthest stake. Hadia remained at the gate, one hand still resting on the pocket that held the letter. The second survey team moved with the same mechanical certainty the map had shown years before. Their boots crushed small clods of soil as they worked, the sound carrying across the garden like a slow countdown. She watched them set the first tripod and adjust its legs against the uneven ground. The stone she had disturbed caught the last direct light, its exposed side now visible from the lane. A man nearest the boundary turned his head toward the gate, then looked away again. Hadia did not call out. The auction listing inside her pocket felt heavier than the folded paper should have allowed. Her pulse ticked once against the fabric, a reminder that the documents had chosen this moment to surface. The cottage windows reflected the low sun in 2 separate panes. Between them the chimney stood slightly out of true, a detail the maps had never recorded. Hadia shifted her weight and felt the letter press against her ribs with each breath. The survey team continued their measurements, the click of their equipment carrying across the garden rows that had begun to show gaps where the soil had been left undisturbed too long. She could taste the metal-sharp edge of the afternoon air, sharp with the promise of evening rain. She considered the signature she had traced. It belonged to a line that had chosen distance over return, yet the same line had placed the mortar and the bricks that still held the structure upright. The 2 facts refused to occupy separate spaces. Hadia turned the pocketed letter once more, the edge of the envelope now visible at the seam of her jacket. The second teen finished placing their markers and stepped back to compare notes. One of them pointed toward the cottage, then toward the gate. Hadia stayed where she stood, arms crossed, the documents inside her pocket, and the displaced stone at her feet both serving as markers of what the next month would decide. Chapter 5. Chapter title, Lingering Handshake. At the garden path where the first row of beans had begun to yellow at the tips, Kwame Asante stepped forward and extended his hand. Jiro Nakamura stood with the measuring tape still looped around his wrist, the metal end glinting against the cuff of his shirt. A faint breeze carried the scent of bruised rosemary and dry earth, stirring the brittle leaves that clung to the lower stems. The afternoon light slanted low, casting long shadows that stretched across the cracked soil like accusations yet unspoken. "Kwame Asante," the newcomer said, his words carrying the quick lift of a person who had practiced the introduction on the way over. "Here to see what the property might fetch if the auction moves forward." His palm hovered steady, the skin calloused in a way that suggested tools rather than ledgers. Jiro watched the fingers flex once, a small test of patience. Jiro took the offered hand. The grip settled firm, neither too tight nor slack, and held a fraction longer than the moment required. Through the contact came a faint pull, like the recognition of mortar dust on skin that had never touched the same bricks. A thread of warmth lingered beneath the surface, something that tightened Jiro's chest without reason. He drew back first, the tape clicking once as it rewound into its casing. The sensation clung to his palm like residue. "Jiro Nakamura," he answered. Measuring the load-bearing joints before any decision settles the matter, his gaze flicked to Kwame's face, searching for the source of the odd recognition that had passed between them. Kwame's eyes held steady, yet a muscle shifted in his jaw. Kwame nodded once, already turning his attention to the lane where two volunteers waited with shovels. He lifted his phone, spoke into it with the same lively rhythm that undercut any claim of indifference. "3 more pairs of hands by tomorrow. We clear the overgrowth on the east side, see what the soil remembers." His sentences arrived in bursts, then paused as if listening for the reply inside the line. The volunteers' voices crackled faintly through the speaker, distant and eager. Kwame's free hand rested on the gatepost, fingers drumming once before he stilled them against the weathered wood. Jiro returned to the wall he had marked earlier. The tape stretched again, precise clicks marking each joint. From the phone came the volunteers' distant voices confirming arrival times. Kwame's free hand rested on the gatepost, fingers drumming once before he stilled them. Inside his thoughts the rhythm faltered, the handshake's echo refused to fade, pressing against the edges of his focus like an unfinished sentence. He glanced sideways at Jiro's measured movements, wondering what the other man had felt in that brief contact. The argument began over the third row, where Farida had once planted the rosemary that now competed with volunteer grass. Kwame suggested cutting back the older stems to let light reach the new growth. Jiro answered that the roots needed another season before any blade touched them. The words hung between them, weighted by the garden's stillness. Kwame shifted his weight, boots scuffing lightly against the path, while Jiro's posture remained unyielding, shoulders square beneath the measured tape. "The yellowing spreads when the stems stay crowded," Kwame said. His voice kept its outward energy, yet the pauses between words lengthened. "We lose the row either way if nothing changes." He reached toward a stem, fingers hovering without touching, as if testing the air itself. Inside, the near revelation of his father's name pressed forward, a habit of outbidding that had once secured parcels like this one for family advantage. Jiro's reply stayed low. The same row held through the last dry spell, because no one altered the pattern. He set the tape down and reached for a single leaf, its edge already brittle between his fingers. The leaf crumbled at the touch, powdering into dust that drifted to the soil. He studied the residue on his thumb, the faint bitterness of it rising to his nostrils, and wondered how quickly the decay might travel if the pruning began without consent. Kwame's phone rang again. He answered, arranged for the volunteers to wait at the road until the discussion finished. When he hung up, his shoulders had lost some of their forward tilt. The near slip came next. He mentioned his father's habit of outbidding relatives on similar parcels, then caught the name before it left his mouth. The sentence trailed into the afternoon air, leaving a silence that thickened like gathering fog. Jiro's eyes narrowed slightly, the question forming, but unspoken. Along the same row, the leaves curled inward, edges darkening within the space of 2 breaths. Soil along the base cracked in thin lines that had not been visible at the start of the exchange. The decay followed the line of tension between the two men, moving outward from the rosemary toward the beans, a visible seam of unease spreading underfoot. "Your measurements won't stop the corporate listing," Kwame said. The lively tone had thinned. 3 weeks is the window they gave the ledger. He stepped closer to the row, hands open at his sides, the gesture half invitation and half challenge. Jiro's diction remained exact. "Your volunteers will finish what the survey stakes began if the pruning continues without agreement." He did not raise his voice, yet the words carried the weight of accusation that the garden itself seemed to register. A faint pulse beat at his temple as he watched another leaf darken. The shared grip from earlier lingered in memory, raising questions he could not voice. What bloodline might bind two strangers across this contested ground? Kwame extended his hand a second time, the motion slower than the first. The contact held again, longer still, and the blood tie surfaced in the shared pressure. A name, Equincy, passed through the grip without either man speaking it aloud. Jiro felt the recognition settle in the same instant. Kwame's fingers loosened, a jolt of lineage that neither could retract. Their eyes met briefly, each registering the other's sudden withdrawal. Both stepped back. The auction notice, loosened from where Hadia had tucked it earlier, lifted on a low gust and settled between their boots. Its printed date faced upward, the corporate heading plain against the soil. The paper's edge trembled in the settling air. At the lane, the volunteers stood in a loose group, tools resting against their legs. The exposed lineage between the two men remained suspended, neither confirmed nor denied, while the yellowed leaves continued their quiet advance along the row. Chapter 6. Binta Equincy pulled the cottage door wider as the first figures approached along the lane, her hand steady on the latch, though the afternoon light already pulled shadows across the threshold. The air carried the faint bitterness of turned earth and the sharper trace of rain that had not yet fallen, a low pressure settling over the garden rows she had watched all morning. Jiro Nakamura stepped inside first, his measured nod carrying the quiet precision of a person who measured joints before speaking. His shoulders remained squared beneath the faded jacket, eyes flicking once toward the corners of the room as if checking for shifts in foundation. Behind him came Kwame Asante, his stride still carrying the lively rhythm from earlier garden exchanges, though the energy now moved with careful restraint, his hands opening and closing at his sides. Hadia Rahman followed with arms already folded across her chest, the fabric of her sleeves pulled taut, her gaze moving past Binta to the table without lingering on any single face. The kitchen table waited under the low lamp, its surface cleared for the letter fragments Binta had arranged in careful rows that morning. She moved to the table without further greeting, fingers tracing the edge of one yellowed sheet as the others settled into chairs. The decoded pieces formed an uneven map of names and dates, some smudged from decades of handling, the ink bleeding at the edges where moisture had once reached them. The lamplight threw small, restless circles across the paper, catching on the ridges of old folds and the faint creases where someone long ago had pressed too hard with a pen. Outside the window, the garden rows showed fresh darkening at the edges, the decay from the previous exchange now visible even from this distance, leaves curling inward with a dryness that caught the light like brittle parchment. Jiro paused by the sill and nodded slowly toward the soil, the motion small but deliberate, his breath fogging the lower pane for an instant before fading. Hadia uncrossed her arms long enough to lean forward, her voice crisp as she asked what these papers changed about the 3-week window. The question hung without echo, her fingers drumming once against the table edge before she folded her arms again. Kwame answered with a proposal for a collective vote, his words carrying the introspective turn that undercut any brashness, suggesting they tally commitments before the ledger closed. He leaned back in his chair as he spoke, watching the others rather than the papers, one thumb tracing the seam of his sleeve. Binta listened, the reflective cadence of her reply leaving space between each clause, as if testing how the syllables might land across generations. She kept her palms flat against the wood, feeling the grain press into her skin. The first reading began with a fragment about land titles signed under pressure, the language formal and withholding. Hadia's arms folded again at the mention of inheritance disputes, her posture sharpening, jaw tightening as though she tasted something sour. Jiro remained at the window, attention divided between the text and the beans that continued their inward curl, the stems now showing thin lines of pale underleaf that had not been there the day before. Time pressed here, in the way the lamp's circle of light failed to reach the far corners of the room where earlier decades had once held different gatherings, the air cooler there, and carrying the faint mineral scent of stone that had not been warmed since morning. Midway through the second fragment, Binta's thoughts turned inward without warning. She saw the pattern of silences her own father had maintained, the way one withheld page after another had narrowed what each descendant could claim, and the realization settled like soil settling after rain. She almost spoke the full name then, but held it, the hesitation a familiar weight at her throat, her thumb pressing harder against the table edge, until the pulse there echoed back. The room felt smaller with each name read aloud, the walls holding the sound of her own voice longer than they should. Kwame's voice shifted the room again, asking whether the corporate listing could be met with names gathered from these same pages. He gestured toward the fragments without touching them, the movement open but measured, as if offering something that might still be refused. Binta drew a breath and read the paternal betrayal fragment aloud, her tone even as the words named the Equinzi line broken by one signature that chose silence over claim. The name left her mouth and hung between them, the first time it had been spoken in the cottage since the letters arrived. Hadia's fingers tightened on her sleeves. Jiro's shoulders eased a fraction, though his eyes stayed on the darkening garden. Hadia set her hands flat on the table, the motion an adjustment rather than surrender, her breath leaving her in a slow release that stayed cold. Jiro turned from the window, his diction exact when he noted that the survey stakes already aligned with the sale terms, each word placed like a measurement taken twice. Kwame extended a hand toward the group, the gesture open yet carrying the weight of an earlier grip that had passed a recognition. Neither man had claimed outright, his gaze flicking once to Jiro before returning to the papers. The new auction letter lay unfolded near the center of the table, its demand for signatures within 7 days printed in clear type that left no margin for further delay, the ink still sharp against the page. Farida al-Mansour's voice surfaced in memory then. An earlier echo carried through one of the letters Binta had set aside, reminding them that garden cycles once broken required more than new rows to restore. The words arrived as if spoken from the doorway, warm and layered with metaphors of seasons that refused to align, carrying the faint trace of dried herbs that had once hung above the stove. No one commented on the echo, yet the room held its pause longer than necessary, the silence stretching until the lamp wick popped softly. Jiro and Kwame met each other's glance across the table, the exchange withholding the full damage from the garden row, the mortar fragment still hidden, the blood tie unconfirmed. Their eyes held for the length of a single breath, then broke apart without acknowledgement. Binta kept the second hidden page in her pocket, its corner pressing against her palm as the group discussed signatures. The page held another Equinci reference, one that would widen the fractures if read now, and she traced the table edge instead, the gesture pulling her back to the present arrangement of fragments. The phone rang from the sideboard, its tone cutting across the lamplight before any vote could form. Kwame reached for it first, the receiver already lifting as the buyer's final offer began its measured delivery into the room. The call carried the weight of the deadline closing, the voice on the other end stating terms that would require every name present, or else the listing would proceed without them. Binta stood without moving toward the phone, her fingers still at the table's edge, as the offer repeated its conditions, each word landing against the quiet like another stake driven into the soil. The name Equinci lingered in the air between the spoken fragments and the unanswered demand, each descendant registering its presence without yet repeating it. Outside, the garden leaves darkened another fraction along the row, the seam of unease advancing toward the cottage steps, while the receiver remained in Kwame's hand. Chapter 7. Farida al-Mansour tilted her head toward the cottage windows, where the last streaks of daylight slipped behind the hedgerows, the light thinning into a bruised violet that pressed against the glass like a held breath. She placed the shallow bowl on the scarred table, and set the final letter fragment inside it without ceremony, her fingers lingering a moment longer than necessary on the brittle edge. The others formed a loose circle around her, their shadows stretching long across the floorboards in uneven lines that seemed to pull away from the center. Jiro Nakamura stood nearest the door, his measuring tape still coiled in one pocket, the brass clip catching the fading glow as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Kwame Asante rested one palm flat on the table edge, the wood grain cool beneath his skin, while Hadia Rahman crossed her arms once then let them fall to her sides, the motion revealing a faint tremor in her wrist before it vanished. Binta Equinci traced a single-leaf vein on the dried sprig she carried, the motion slow and deliberate, her eyes half-lidded as though measuring the distance between what she held and what waited to be spoken. Farida struck a match and held it to the fragment. The paper caught with a thin curl of smoke that smelled of old ink and garden soil, the scent threading upward and settling against the low ceiling beams. She began the words of the mid-air ritual in a low voice that carried the rhythm of stories told across many evenings, each syllable drawn out as though testing the air for resistance. Each phrase named a season and the work that season demanded: the planting, the pruning, the silent endurance of winter. The flame settled into a steady glow inside the bowl, casting small reflections on the faces around her. The first resistance came from Hadia. She stepped back half a pace when Farida spoke the name of the paternal line that had signed away the first parcels of land, her breath catching as the words landed. Her shoulders tightened, and she looked toward the darkened garden rather than the circle, the movement breaking the even spacing. But no one reached to draw her back. Inside her thoughts a question formed and dissolved: how much of this inheritance was already claimed by absences no ritual could fill? Farida continued without pause, her timbre still warm yet edged now with the weight of what the words summoned, the sound of her voice weaving through the growing dusk like a thread pulled taut. Binta Ekwenzi lifted her gaze from the sprig. Her voice remained measured, each sentence spaced by the pause of a person who had rehearsed the telling in private, the rehearsal itself a shield against the listening faces. She named the father who had withheld the second deed, and the uncle who had carried the letter across 2 borders before sealing it inside a book, her tone never rising even as the names left small silences in their wake. She spoke the dates and the amounts offered for the cottage, her fingers stilling on the sprig when she reached the final sum, the others listening without interruption, the only sound the faint crack of the burning paper and the distant creak of settling wood. Jiro's jaw flexed once, a muscle jumping beneath his skin. Kwame's palm pressed harder against the table, leaving a faint damp print. Hadia's arms tightened again across her chest, her eyes fixed on the flame as though it might answer the doubt rising in her own chest. The vision arrived not as a single image but as a sequence of rooms emptying, the air inside the cottage thickening with the weight of what unfolded behind closed lids. The cottage appeared first with boards across the windows and the auction sign planted where the path met the road, the painted letters stark against weathered wood. Garden rows lay cracked and white, the soil lifted into dust that drifted against the foundation stones, carrying the dry taste of abandonment on the tongue. Jiro Nakamura's hands opened at his sides as though measuring the width of the loss, his fingers twitching as if seeking the familiar weight of his tape. Farida's own father's voice threaded through the silence inside the vision, repeating the single instruction to keep the papers locked away, the repetition itself a hollow space that refused to close. She flinched at the echo but did not look away, the memory of his withheld explanations rising like smoke that refused to dissipate. Binta completed the 3 acts of the circle by placing her sprig beside the bowl, then touching the table once, then stepping forward to stand where Hadia had withdrawn. The gesture closed the space, her breath steady as the others registered the shift without comment. The vision held for another breath before the dust settled, and the sign leaned at an angle against the evening light, the boards on the windows seeming to press inward. Kwame Asante exhaled through his teeth, the sound quiet and steady, while Hadia's gaze finally returned to the circle, her expression unreadable. One edge of the vision lingered longer for Jiro. The boards on the windows shifted to reveal a single unpacked trunk and a child's drawing pinned beneath them, the lines of crayon faded yet sharp enough to pull at the edges of memory. The image carried the sharp scent of fresh-cut pine from the rafters above his own boyhood room, the smell cutting through the ritual smoke and lodging in his throat. He pressed his thumb against the table grain until the grain bit back, the small pain anchoring him as the trauma surfaced as a clear demand. The trunk must be opened before any signature was given. No one else saw the trunk, yet the room waited while he steadied his breath, the silence stretching long enough for each person to feel the weight of their own unvoiced questions. Farida's voice cracked on the next line of the ritual, the break small but audible, like a thread snapping beneath too much tension. She admitted the cost of breaking the cycle was the admission itself, spoken aloud in the presence of those who would carry it forward, the words leaving her mouth heavier than intended. The admission left a space in the air where earlier comfort had rested, her hands curling slightly at her sides as though to catch what had escaped. The flame inside the bowl lowered, then steadied again, the light reflecting in eyes that now held more shadow than before. The house silhouette remained against the auction sign until the last of the vision thinned, the boards and dust receding like a tide that refused to return. The sign itself bore the 7-day clause in the same clear type that had lain on the table earlier, the letters sharp against the failing light. Binta's fingers stilled on the sprig once more, her posture unchanged even as the circle held its shape, though the light had gone fully to dusk. Outside, the garden rows darkened another fraction, the seam of unease now reaching the first stone of the path, while the phone on the sideboard remained silent, its presence a quiet accusation that every person in the room registered as another name that had not yet been spoken. No one spoke when the final fragment collapsed into ash. The bowl held only a thin line of gray that settled without stirring the air, the last curl of smoke dissolving into the growing dark. The room seemed to contract around the table, each breath measured, each gaze lowered or averted, the collective stillness carrying the shape of decisions still forming. Chapter 8. Jiro Nakamura unrolled the first blueprint across the garden table, its edges curling against the morning chill as he weighted them with smooth stones gathered from the path. The letter from Binta Ekwensi lay open beside it, its faded ink guiding his measurements for the north window frame. 3 weeks had already narrowed to days, and the buyer's claws pressed like a second hand on every joint he planned to reset. The paper smelled faintly of old dust and something sharper, like forgotten ink drying in sunlight. He pressed his palm flat against one corner, feeling the faint resistance of the fibers, and wondered how many hands had traced these lines before his own. He traced the lines with a pencil that left faint graphite trails, each one marking where the original beams met the newer additions from the 1950s. The graphite whispered against the page in short, deliberate strokes. Kwame Asante approached from the rows Farida Al-Mansour had planted, offering a roster of local carpenters who could share the load. His footsteps crunched softly over the gravel, and he held the folded paper out without haste, his expression open yet watchful. Jiro shook his head once, slow and deliberate, the gesture echoing the way his father had dismissed help during the last family repair on the city house decades earlier. The refusal rose in his chest like a reflex he could not name, carrying the weight of every silent evening his father had worked alone. "I have the sequence from the letter," Jiro said, his words precise and without flourish. "Additional hands would only alter the alignment we need." He kept his gaze on the blueprint, avoiding the question that lingered in Kwame's steady eyes. Kwame lingered a moment longer. Shifting his weight from one foot to the other, the roster still extended between them like an unfinished sentence. Then he turned back toward the gate without pressing further. The refusal settled between them like dust on an unused shelf. Jiro continued alone, lifting the first plank and fitting it against the wall where the vision had shown the board shift. He drove the nails deeper than the diagram advised, the hammer strike sending small vibrations through the brick that he chose not to measure twice. Each impact traveled up his forearm in a dull throb, and he paused between strikes to listen for any answering shift in the mortar. The risk of permanent wall damage hovered at the edge of his thoughts, yet the buyer's deadline left no room for the slower attunement the letter seemed to require. By dusk, the first window sat in place, its new pane catching the last light. Behind the glass, a folded paper emerged from a gap in the mortar, its surface creased in the same pattern as the letter on the table. Jiro unfolded it under the single bulb Farida had strung along the path. The map inside showed names linked across 3 generations, including a branch that led to a cousin never mentioned in any family gathering. The ink had bled slightly at the edges, as though the paper had once been damp. He traced one line with a fingertip, feeling the slight ridge where the pen had pressed hard, and a quiet unease stirred. Why had no one spoken of this cousin during the long evenings of family stories? The revelation held for only a breath before the work resumed. Night stretched across the garden, and Jiro kept at the second frame, his slow nods accompanying each adjustment of the level. The soil beneath his boots gave way more readily than it had that morning, the surface yielding as though the earth itself approved the solitary pace. Binta watched from the doorway once, her fingers tracing the vein of a nearby leaf before she withdrew without speaking. Her silence carried its own question, one he could not yet answer. Midnight passed, then one. The third act of the sequence called for removal of an internal brace that the letter described as temporary. Jiro loosened it anyway, feeling the wall settle with a faint settling sigh that the diagrams had not predicted. The link to the earlier vision thinned in his mind, the pine scent from the trunk fading before he could name what it carried. He straightened slowly, rolling his shoulders against the stiffness that had crept in, and wondered whether the rush sequence had already begun to fray whatever fragile connection the house still offered. At noon the representative arrived, a man in a press coat who stood at the gate and called out the demand for immediate inspection. His voice carried across the garden with clipped authority, each word landing like a measured step on stone. Hadia Rahman met him first, her arms initially crossed before she accepted the envelope he extended. She carried the papers inside, placing them on the table beside Jiro's tools. The envelope's seal broke with a soft rip that seemed too loud in the quiet space. "Please grant one more week," Hadia said, her tone crisp at first, then softening as she read the clause aloud. "The clause on the auction can be postponed if we file the intent to restore." She watched Jiro's face carefully, her own expression shifting between relief and caution. Jiro set down the hammer. His voice, usually even, fractured on the next sentence. The sequence may already have cost the connection the letter required. I followed it too quickly. The admission hung in the air while the representative waited outside, his foot tapping against the stone. Jiro felt the words leave him like a thread pulled loose, exposing a doubt he had kept hidden even from himself. The house answered in its own measure. Brick, that had stayed cool all morning, warmed, where the 3 completed sections met the garden wall, the change noticeable only when Jiro placed his palm against it. The warmth spread slowly beneath his fingers, as though the structure itself were testing his resolve. The map from the window lay open beside the new papers, its lines revealing that one of the unmentioned descendants had once held the title, deed Farida had hidden years before. Jiro folded the final blueprint piece and slipped it into his pocket. The representative remained at the gate, checking his watch as the light shifted toward afternoon. Inside, the trunk from the vision stayed closed, though the new map now pointed to its contents as the next required step before any further signatures. Farida joined them at the table, tilting her head toward the windows as she spoke of how each era had left its own marks on the same walls. Her voice moved gently over the history, yet Jiro heard the undercurrent of concern beneath the words. The garden rows held their shape, the unease along the path now crossed by fresh footprints from the night's work. Jiro watched the representative through the restored glass, the 1-week extension already reshaping the silence that had followed the ash in the bowl the evening before. The representative's silhouette remained rigid, one hand still resting on the gate latch, and Jiro wondered how long the fragile reprieve would hold once the man stepped inside. Chapter 9. Hadia Rahman stood among the new rows Farida had planted, the receiver pressed to her ear as she recited the deed clauses to the solicitor in London. The garden soil still held the chill from the previous night's work, yet small shoots had pushed through the crust overnight, their edges catching the light that now angled across the cottage wall. She had arrived expecting to manage another delay, but the voice on the line demanded confirmation of all living claimants before any extension could proceed. Damp earth clung to the hem of her trousers, and each faint rustle of leaves overhead seemed to press against her concentration, reminding her that the land itself listened. The clause requires every descendant to be listed by name and relation, the solicitor said. Hadia's free hand remained folded across her middle, the same posture she had kept through every previous call. She listed the known names without pause, her words crisp as she reached Binta Ekwensi and Jiro Nakamura. Inside her chest, a familiar knot tightened. She wondered how many more names would surface before the solicitor grew impatient and withdrew the offer altogether. A warmth rose from the brick where the 3 restored sections met the garden wall. It traveled outward along the mortar lines, faint at first, then steady enough that Hadia lowered the receiver for a moment to watch the color return to the faded stone. The change happened in the time it took her to draw breath, as though the structure had waited only for her to speak the names aloud. She caught herself tracing the edge of one warming brick with her thumb, the texture rough yet alive beneath her skin, and the sensation sent an unexpected tremor through her forearm. She resumed the call, describing the inheritance line that ran through Farida al-Mansour's earlier caretaking. As the solicitor asked for documentation of the unmentioned branch, a memory surfaced without warning, Hadia at 12, standing in the doorway of her mother's kitchen while adults discussed the sale of a distant property in lowered voices. She had been told to leave the room before any papers were opened. The same tightness returned now to her shoulders, though the garden air carried the scent of turned earth instead of the old linoleum. Her fingers tightened around the receiver. She could almost hear the scrape of chairs being pulled closer, the deliberate hush that had followed her mother's protests. "There was a letter," she said into the receiver, surprising herself with the admission. "It names another line that held the title before the auction was proposed." Her arms uncrossed as she spoke. She let the hand that had been guarding her ribs rest against the low wall, fingers tracing the seam where new warmth met older brick. The movement felt like releasing a held breath she had carried for years, and she wondered whether the solicitor on the other end could sense the shift in her voice. Jiro Nakamura stepped from the cottage doorway, carrying the folded map from the previous day. He placed it on the garden bench without interrupting, then nodded once toward the reviving shoots. Hadia met his eyes briefly before returning to the call. His expression held neither expectation nor doubt, only a quiet acknowledgement that left room for her to continue. She noticed the way his shoulders eased once he stepped back, as though he too felt the garden's slow awakening underfoot. The memory sharpened. In the kitchen of her childhood, the adults had folded a document away before her mother could read it fully. Years later, Hadia learned the omission had cost them any claim to the land. Here, the parallel held a different weight. The betrayal letter that Binta Equensi had found decades earlier mirrored that silence, yet the cottage walls now seemed to record each spoken name as the color continued to spread. She imagined the brick drinking in every syllable, sealing it against future erasures. "I will include the full history in the submission," Hadia said. Her tone had lost its earlier edge. She described the clause that still threatened the connection. If the final ceremony failed within the 7 days, the extension would collapse and the property would return to open auction. The solicitor noted the risk without comment, but the pause that followed made her pulse quicken. She pictured the papers sliding back across a polished desk in London, the extension vanishing like steam from a cooling kettle. Farida al-Mansour appeared at the far end of the path, carrying a small bundle of cuttings. She paused when she saw Hadia still on the phone, then set the bundle down and tilted her head toward the windows, as though listening to the house itself. The garden scent drifted inward through the open frames, carrying the sharp green of new growth mixed with the dust of old plaster. Hadia inhaled at once, deeply, and felt the air settle inside her lungs like a promise she had not yet earned. Hadia signed the papers on the bench, the pen moving steadily across each page. She placed the completed forms beside the original letter fragment that had been kept on the table since the first discovery. The act felt heavier than the legal weight alone. It pulled forward the years she had spent keeping family matters at a distance. Her signature dried slowly in the open air, the ink darkening against the page as the scent of turned soil grew stronger through the windows. Kwame Asante arrived at the gate a moment later, his arrival marked only by the sound of the latch. He offered no greeting at first, instead watching the wall where the new color had settled. Hadia ended the call and set the receiver down. She gathered the papers into a single stack, aligning the edges with care, while the silence stretched between them like a held note. The cottage held the quiet that followed any completed call. Then a narrow crack opened along the upper course of the restored wall, fine as a hairline yet visible against the fresh tone of the brick. It ran from the point where the garden wall met the house toward the window that faced the road. Binta Equensi stepped from the cottage with the others gathering behind her. They stood together on the path, no one yet moving to examine the new fissure. Hadia remained by the bench, the signed papers still in her hand, while the scent from the rose continued to move through the open windows. Chapter 10. Kwame Asante reached the gate first, his palm already outstretched as the others approached along the narrow path. The afternoon air hung heavy with the scent of damp soil and crushed herbs, each breath carrying the faint sharp tang of recent rain against the bricks. Binta Equensi met his grip without hesitation, yet the pressure between their palms lingered several seconds longer than courtesy required. Her fingers tightened once, a silent acknowledgment of the years they had both spent guarding separate fragments of the same hidden correspondence. Jiro Nakamura followed, his nod precise as their hands clasped. Flecks of morning soil still clung beneath his nails, grounding the moment in the work they had already shared. Hadia Rahman came next, her measured steps slowing further before she uncrossed her arms, allowing the second clasp to settle fully. Farida al-Mansour arrived last of the core group, head tilting toward the cottage windows as though listening for an echo only she could detect. The meeting of palms stretching out until the silence between them grew weighted with unspoken tests. The garden rose lay uneven beneath slanted light, young shoots straining upward through earth that had been turned and retuned repeatedly without ever achieving perfect rest. A representative from the auction house waited at the far end of the path, clipboard braced against one forearm, his stance blocking direct passage with the patient insistence of deadlines that refused to bend. No one stepped forward to challenge him outright. Instead, neighbors from the surrounding lanes began drifting closer, shoulders aligning until they formed a living barrier that transformed the gate into a threshold no single signature could override. Within the protective circle, Kwame spoke first, his lively rhythm undercut by quieter reflection that invited each arrival to answer in turn. "We begin here because the land remembers what papers forget," he said, moving among them to repeat the lingering clasp. Jiro added precise observations about the restored wall joints, his voice low as he traced one seam with a fingertip, while Hadia noted the legal phrasing on the distant clipboard without raising her volume. Farida wove garden metaphors into her sentences, describing roots that reached across decades, her gaze flicking briefly toward Binta, as though checking whether the words landed as intended. Binta remained near the bench, fingers tracing its restored edge, where an earlier letter fragment still rested beneath a loose board. The fissure along the upper brick had not widened since the signing, yet its presence pressed against every glance like an unfinished sentence. She watched the community line hold its ground as the representative shifted his weight, clipboard lowering slightly, but never fully retreating. Time stretched between one breath and the next, carrying echoes of decisions made in other rooms long before any of them stood here. Decisions that had kept bloodlines hidden and letters sealed until necessity forced them open. The ceremony unfolded through repeated, deliberate actions rather than speeches. Seeds from the saved cuttings went into the final rows, each participant adding a handful of soil in synchronized movements that needed no spoken command. At the midpoint, as the last row took shape, Binta's thoughts sharpened into an inward rush. The decades of holding letters unopened, the silences that had protected the cottage yet isolated each generation, the fear that true attunement might demand more openness than any of them had practiced. The reflection passed quickly, leaving her fingertips pressed harder against a single leaf vein whose texture seemed to pulse with the same hesitation she felt. Rows began to bloom in unison, small flowers opening along stems that had shown no color moments earlier. The attunement tier settled with a subtle shift in the air, the house responding through a warmth that traveled from brick to brick, softening the edges of old repairs. The representative at the gate lowered his clipboard further as the line of volunteers remained unbroken, their presence turning his inspection into observation rather than interruption. Kwame's shoulders eased fractionally, though his eyes continued scanning the faces around him for any sign of retreat. A new envelope surfaced beneath the restored bench, its edge visible only after the final handful of soil settled. Kwame retrieved it without ceremony and opened the flap. His usual guarded expression fell away as he read the contents aloud to the gathered circle, voice steady yet carrying an unexpected tremor when he revealed his own blood connection through precise details of a shared ancestor who had once maintained the same garden paths. The letter addressed future caretakers directly, asking who among the next arrivals would choose to stay when the current work ended. Around the circle, reactions rippled without words. Jiro's posture straightened, Hadia's brow furrowed in calculation, Farida's storytelling cadence paused mid-breath. Hadia's nod came last and remained incomplete, arms crossing once more before settling halfway down. The doubt lingered visibly in the gesture, a habit of alignment after resistance that those who knew her recognized at once. Farida resumed her storytelling timbre, linking the blooming rose to earlier seasons without naming the lost years outright, while Jiro listened with characteristic quiet, warmth reserved for the endurance he saw in the settled bricks. Binta's gaze moved between them, registering each withheld response and wondering how many more secrets the letter might still conceal. Kwame crossed to Jiro for the final handshake, the clasp extending as the revealed bloodline settled between them like an additional signature. The cottage responded with deeper warmth, restored sections absorbing the change until every brick held a faint heat that reached outward toward the path. The community line at the gate dispersed only after the representative turned away, clipboard now tucked under his arm. Binta sealed the new letter back into its envelope and slid it beneath the bench once more. Her fingers traced one fresh leaf vein as the paper disappeared from view. The question it carried about the next generation remained unanswered in the air, carried forward on the scent of turned earth and new growth. The house held its warmth steady, a quiet invitation that waited without insistence for whoever might arrive after them.